Operation Barbarossa, this is the code name that the Germans will give to the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Barbarossa was a Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century, I believe. And what does that mean, Barbarossa? What does that mean? Those of you in the Nazi class should remember this. Redbeard. There was a legend that the Redbeard was buried in the mountains in southern Germany, and that at the time of Germany's greatest need, Redbeard would come back and save Germany. But Redbeard, Frederick Barbarossa, the king, the emperor, he had actually gone east to fight in the Crusades. He dies on the way in Turkey, so he never actually gets there. But so it's kind of it's codenamed in honor of him. They're pushing east now, right? The Soviets will call this the Great Patriotic War. The Great Patriotic War. Even to this day in Russia, most Russians will refer to this as the Great Patriotic War. And in many ways, it will be just that. It will, for the first time, for many Soviet citizens, legitimize the Soviet state. And, war tends to dramatize the state, and through that dramatization, people become invested, and you get kind of a legitimacy through it. And so you're going to see the Soviets will have a much more legitimate claim to rule after the Second World War. Now, this war between the Soviets and the Germans arguably is the decisive theater of World War II. The decisive theater of World War II. I say arguably because, well, there have been arguments made that it's not. I believe I've mentioned before Phillips Payson O'Brien, who wrote a great book about production, and one of his big things is production, and the fact that some nations that have freedom of movement and that can interdict their enemies' freedom of movement, they're the ones that won. So with that idea in mind of production and that idea of freedom of movement, he actually says the war is in fact won in the West as a result of the British and more to the point, the American contributions to the war. But if you're talking in terms of sheer commitment of manpower and resources and size of battles and deaths in battles, the Eastern Front is it, right? The Soviet Union is it. The heaviest casualties of the war will be on the Eastern Front. In fact, the Soviets in World War II will lose about 27 million people. 27 million people. Only about 8 or 9 of those were soldiers. 25 million people will be left homeless as a result of the war. And here's the real kicker, and here's why we can make this argument about the East being the decisive theater more than anything else. 75% of all German casualties in World War II were inflicted by a Soviet. 75% of all German casualties. In fact, when we talk about D-Day in a few weeks, D-Day would not have been possible if the bulk of the German army was not in Russia. Because from the time the war against Russia begins in June of 1941 until the end of the war, about 4/5 of the German army will be in Russia. Right? That's 1/5 of the German army is covering the rest of Europe. 4/5 of the army is in Russia. Germany will lose about 4 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. Its allies, Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, Slovaks, they will lose about another million. About 4.5 million Axis soldiers will be taken prisoner. About 4.5 million Axis soldiers will be taken prisoner in Russia. And the Soviet losses, the dramatic Soviet losses, most of them will be inflicted in 1941 with a surprise invasion. Most of them will be inflicted in 1941. By 1942 and into 1943, losses tend to kind of even out after that. And the Chinese possibly lost more people than the Soviet Union, but it's China and the Soviets are going to have the highest casualties in the war. Now, throughout the 1930s, Stalin is obsessed with modernization, industrialization, and kind of central to the idea of modernization is the modernization of the army, of the Red Army. Part of this is, and we discussed this a little bit that first week, but in the 1930s, Stalin is convinced that sooner or later, Western powers will invade the Soviet Union. And he has to fight them. He will have to fight them. he won't be able to fight them if Russia is not industrialized. The Soviet Union is not industrialized. So he does this essentially crash program in the 30s to industrialize the Soviet Union. Now, at the heart of the modernization of the Red Army is this guy here, Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He had actually been born to a noble family, like a lower noble family in Russia. But he had supported the Bolsheviks in the civil war against the White Russians in the 1920s. Now, he and Stalin butted heads before they, when the Red Army invaded Poland in 1919 or 1920. They had nearly taken Warsaw, but it didn't. And the leader of that field army was Tukhachevsky, and his political officer was Stalin. And they each kind of blamed each other for not being able to take Warsaw. So he and Stalin kind of have a significant disagreement here. And trust me, you don't want to have a significant disagreement with Joseph Stalin. You just don't. Well, not only that, but as the Red Army is trying to innovate here and modernize, frequently, of course, the Communist Party, that is to say Stalin, was trying to keep their reins on it. Because, again, the army is the only real institution in Russia that could conceivably pose a threat to Stalin. He needs the army, right? You've got to be able to defend yourself. But at the same time, that could be where the fatal blow comes from. So he keeps tight watch on the army. He keeps tight control of the army. He makes oftentimes irrational decisions about the army just to show that he's the guy in charge, right? Just to keep the generals in their place. Tukhachevsky is a loyal communist. He is a true believer in communism, but he is not a Stalinist. He does not believe in this cult of personality that's developing around Stalin. He rejects that. And he also tends to clash with other generals in the Red Army who are more conservative, who are more kind of want to follow Stalin's line here, conservative within the Soviet sphere, of course, that want to follow the Stalin's line. And one of the things Tukhachevsky's opponents, these more conservative fellows in the Red Army, emphasizes, they really think, and this is a problem that's going on to a much lesser extent in the United States at this time, and even in some of these other countries, and that is, what is the role of horse cavalry? What is the role of, traditionally, historically, horse cavalry had been very important. One of the critical roles of horse cavalry historically was your cavalry, like if you look at the U.S. Civil War, cavalry is your eyes. It's how you find the enemy. It's how you position the enemy. It's how you see where he is. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee really took Jeb Stuart to task because Jeb Stuart with his cavalry was a hot shot. He took his cavalry and he rode it all the way around the Union Army to kind of just show that he could do it, right? Meanwhile, he left Lee blind. And Lee, right after they get that encounter battle at Gettysburg, which may not have happened there had they known where the Union Army was, he takes him to task. He says, I cannot see without you. You can't just go riding off like that. So cavalry played an important role. But cavalry also, historically, certainly before the 20th century, cavalry is your mobility. It is your striking power, right? You could get around units of men much faster on horseback than you could by running or walking, So it's your mobility. And then, too, there's this other... So it's proven itself useful. Going back to the Greeks and the Romans, horses are important, right? Horses are very important in warfare. But then, too, aside from any kind of utility, actual military utility, there's just this romance that some officers have always had with horses, this idea. Because usually it's your officers and higher-ups and noble that are on, there's a prestige of being on horseback. And these people love the animals, they love that. And that's a hard thing to cut through. But the reality is, in World War I, you don't have any great cavalry charges. There are no great cavalry. The last great cavalry charge took place in the 1890s at Ormendun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Ormendun in North Africa, when the British were going after the adherents of the Mahdi. The Mahdi was a religious figure, not unlike Osama bin Laden, who called the Muslim world to war against the West, and that was the last time we saw a real cavalry charge which defeated their armies. And the Mahdi had actually died by that time as a successor. But the reality is why we don't have any great cavalry charges in World War I, and we had cavalry in World War I. Virtually every army has cavalry armies behind the line waiting for a breach in the line that then the cavalry could move in and exploit. Okay? So every army has cavalry ready to go that never go. Because the reality is a machine gun is going to tear through horse flesh just like human flesh, right? Horses are just as susceptible to a machine gun. That's really fundamentally what the issue here is. Yeah, I think I read somewhere, I think it was in Thomas Fleming's book, he said the United States Army in World War I, literally 1/3 of everything that was shipped from the United States to Europe during World War I was horse feed, right? Stuff to take care of horses that ultimately have absolutely no bearing on that war, right? But the people didn't want to give up the idea that cavalry was still going to play a role. Now, horses are still important, right? I mean, certainly we've seen the German army, the bulk of the German army is still horsebound. You still use horses for supply. That's fine. But to put a horse in a frontline unit, you're just going to kill the horse, right? So a lot of these opponents of Tukhachevsky still think horses and cavalry are going to be valuable. The horses had actually played a pretty good role in the Civil War when there weren't a lot of machine guns. The Russians didn't have a lot of machine guns, so it made sense in the Russian Civil War. But, to a lot of these guys that favor horse cavalry are toadies. They follow Stalin, and it's kind of a way they can object here. But with other kind of forward-thinking, progressive-thinking officers, Tukhachevsky actually comes up with something here called deep operations. Deep operations. Now, deep operations is very similar. I'm not going to get into the differences because there are some differences. But it's very similar to the ideas of blitzkrieg operations. Bewegungskrieg, what the Germans are doing, war of maneuver, what Heinz Guderian and Oswald Lutz and other tank innovators are thinking about in Germany, what Charles de Gaulle is calling for unsuccessfully in France, and what increasingly some American officers will call for in the United States. But deep operations make sense, and it would have worked quite well had it been available to them, But the problem is, well, Tukhachevsky in the military, they're kind of, I don't mean to overgeneralize here, but they're typically, most militaries are two kinds of people. There are people that are there to serve, either in the enlisted ranks or as officers. They're there to serve. They're there to get the promotions. It's a job for them, and you get a lot of benefits in the military, and that's what they're there for, and that's fine. And then you have another group of people who you can really call military intellectuals. And these are people who are really asking questions, who really want to create an efficient military, who really want to go forward here. And again, this is, in France, Charles de Gaulle, he was a military intellectual. He wrote a book called Toward a Professional Army in 1934 that talked about mechanization of their army. All the other officers thought he was an idiot because a lot of them there weren't really thinking, they were kind of thinking in terms of more traditional army, and they're there to punch their clock, right? But Tukhachevsky is a true military intellectual. He's a true military intellectual. He reads extensively, and he read a lot of Charles de Gaulle. He read a lot of what Charles de Gaulle was talking about in France at this time. So he kept up with a lot of these advancements. Now, of course, as we know, in 1936-37, Stalin begins the Great Terror. And we talked about this a little bit, as I said. It's a huge purge by the Stalinists to get rid of non-Stalinist communists, people that are still communists, like Tukhachevsky, but don't follow Stalin's line. Over the course of a few years, there will be throughout the Soviet Union, 700,000 people. These are generally either party officials, bureaucratic officials, or Red Army officers. Almost 700,000 people will be killed, arrested, or at least they will lose their jobs. At least they will lose their jobs. The Central Committee of the Communist Party during this period, the Central Committee, that's kind of your top decision-making guys under Stalin. Central Committee of the Communist Party, 70% of them are purged. 70% of them are purged. And not just purged, they're actively shot. They're actively shot there. 80% of government ministers, that is to say, not just the top people in government, but all of government, 80% of government ministers here are shot as well. And the main instrument of terror, as we know, kind of what is enforcing these purges, is the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. This was originally, Lenin had created the Cheka. This is the successor of the Cheka. Much later, we'll call it the KGB. But even the NKVD itself is not immune to the purges. In fact, between 1937 and 1939, 2 chiefs of the NKVD will be shot. Okay? 2 chiefs of the NKVD will be shot. Another 20,000 members of the NKVD will be shot. So even they're not immune. So really, the Communist Party during these years, it's cannibalizing itself. It's cannibalizing. It's tearing itself apart. And one of the most convincing arguments, or certainly a convincing argument, Stalin knew sooner or later he was going to be at war, and he wanted people he absolutely trusted in positions of power in the government and the military to run things. He needed that, okay? Has anybody seen The Death of Stalin? It's a great film, but there's a great, if you get a chance, watch it. It's a comedy. It's hilarious. There's a great scene where, like, as soon as Stalin's dying, they're clearing up the house. They're, like, packing stuff away, and it's like this really quick montage. And, like, just as soon as somebody, like, will walk around a door, somebody else shoots them. And you see all these guys in blue collars, the NKVD, and they're just shooting people left and right. They're shooting people left and right. And, like, the last thing is this guy goes and he shoots somebody, and then they go ahead and they put him on a truck, and you just see the guy with the blue collars there, and he's like waving as they're going. Somebody stands up behind him and shoots him. And it's funny because it is so dark, but there's a truth under there. You know, human life was incredibly expendable, and it was just, I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. Now the army suffers pretty bad here under the Great Terror. As I mentioned, there were 5 Soviet marshals. 3 of them are shot, including Tukhachevsky. He was a marshal that was shot. 12 army commanders were shot. 12 army commanders were shot. That's field armies. 12 field army commanders were shot. 60 out of 67 corps commanders were shot. 60 out of 67 corps commanders are shot. 136 out of 199 division commanders are shot. So you're gutting a lot of the people here in the army during the purges. The military elite, military leaders, they are just absolutely decimated. And one thing, too, is they don't have, I can't remember what the rank is. I think it's above major. They don't have ranks. What they would do is your position was kind of your rank. So you would be corps commander, div com, division commander. And then I can't remember what army was, but anyway, essentially that's because again they're trying to make things equal, right? There's no generals, right? So they kind of have these weird ranks that they had introduced, and as we'll see when the war comes, they'll get rid of all that crap because it's not effective. 45% of all senior military officers are affected in some way. At most, the worst is they're shot. At least they are lose their jobs. They could be arrested, go to gulags, they'll lose their jobs. Most of them will be dismissed, as I say, from service. And in fact, when I mentioned all these guys being shot, I guess it's probably more accurate to say they were arrested. I don't know that all of them were shot, but they were arrested. Now, when they do this, they don't just arbitrarily say, you're arrested because Stalin doesn't like you. They trump up charges on these guys, right? So they say you're a spy. You're spying for the Japanese. You're spying for the British. You're spying for the Germans. People are accused of spying. People are accused of sabotage. Oh, you know what? You didn't get your army formation from this place to this place in time. Guess what, Commander? You're a saboteur. You're secretly working against the communists. So they come up with stuff. The people that are arrested are beaten badly until they confess. They are beaten badly. Some of them hold out, don't confess. But most of them, you're beaten. You're being told your family may be next. You're going to confess. Now, one fellow here that didn't confess, this is Konstantin Rokossovsky. Konstantin Rokossovsky, one of the greatest Soviet commanders of the war. And Rokossovsky had been arrested during this purge, and he had been sent to a gulag. While he's in the gulag, he's beaten so badly, literally, the NKVD torturers knock every tooth out of his mouth. He didn't confess. Now, eventually, when the war starts, he'll be brought back because they need people that know what they're doing. And famously, he's taken to see Stalin, and Stalin says, "Oh, Rokossovsky, where have you been?" "Oh, well, I've been in a gulag." "Oh, well, that shouldn't have happened. Anyway, we need you here." Stalin knew exactly what had happened. He signed the orders to send this guy there. But that's just kind of the way Stalin was. Now, one thing that maybe does happen here that arguably was helpful is this allows younger officers with more flexible ideas, with less fixed ideas, to move forward. Now, they're not going to move into some of the really important positions at this point, but it is clearing a way for some officers, younger, more dynamic, that have talent to move forward. And they also create a much greater fear of Stalin and the Red Army. Some people in the Red Army perhaps felt like they were protected from some of the worst excesses of the communist system, and after this, they know they're not. They know a lot of them are walking around with targets on their backs. And that actually means a lot of those guys will not want to take initiatives in 1941. They won't want to take the initiative because they don't want to stick out. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. The Red Army is actually going to have its first test even before Finland. We talked about Finland. But something else happens in the summer of 1939, a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. And that is the Red Army is going to fight the Japanese. The Japanese, of course, as we know, had occupied Manchuria, which is on the border of Mongolia. Now, Mongolia was a Soviet client state. Mongolia essentially was a satellite. It kind of was economically dependent on the Soviet Union. The Soviets could interfere with the Mongolian government. And the Japanese had claimed territories in Mongolia as well as some in Russia itself. And they claim this on the basis that these territories historically belonged to Manchuria. And they're just kind of trying to restore Manchuria here. So you start to have some border clashes that take place between the Japanese and the Soviet army here. These are small skirmishes and artillery duels initially, but tensions increase in 1939, and the Japanese just say, we're going to flex our muscles here, and they invade Mongolia. The Japanese invade Mongolia. The commander of the Red Army here is somebody who escaped the purges by the name of Georgy Zhukov. And as we will see, he will be one of the great Soviet commanders of the Second World War. His career really begins here, because the Far East was kind of not seen as an important affront. Georgy Zhukov is sent there, not doing much, and then this stuff starts happening, and he proves to be extraordinarily good and talented when it came to this defense and counterattacks that are made here at the time. We have... he actually uses some of what Tukhachevsky, despite the fact that Stalin had kind of said deep operations is not good, Zhukov actually uses some of what Tukhachevsky was talking about, deep operations here, in fighting the Japanese, right? Again, bypassing strong points, getting around them, cutting them off, bringing infantry in to kind of wipe up. And this main battle here takes a few engagements here over these months, but this is Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese are thoroughly defeated. the Japanese are thoroughly defeated at Khalkhin Gol. The Soviets do very well. Zhukov proves himself to be a first-rate commander here. And when Hitler is, of course, looking at the Soviet Union, he never really pays much attention to what happened here at Khalkhin Gol. He's looking rather at Finland. He's looking at the Soviet experience in Finland. And they were two different kinds of battles, right? What happens in Khalkhin Gol was primarily a defensive action where you do have some counterattacks that occur. But you're trying to defend your border. You're trying to defend a border, which is a completely different animal than attacking and trying to annex another country, right? The terrain is different, right? You're not covered in snow here. You've got wide open fields that you can maneuver tanks on. You're not compressed into the causeways there between the lakes in Finland. You don't have to deal with snow troops. The weather's better. I mean, there's all sorts of factors that play into this here, but Hitler ignores this. Finland showed Hitler the Soviets are incompetent. They are absolutely incompetent when it came to military action. All right, so Hitler and Stalin. Hitler and Stalin. Again, Stalin's belief here is this. When World War II begins, he thinks this is going to be a repeat of World War I. Britain and France will be fighting Germany. There'll be a stalemate. This will bleed all of the belligerents dry. And then what's left over will be ripe for communist revolutions. He can have communist revolutions. And this is the way Europe is going to go communist. All of Europe will go communist, right? And he's quite surprised and disappointed that France fell so quickly. He's like, well, okay, so this isn't going to happen the way I suspected it would be. Now, in the spring of 1941, Stalin begins to receive a number of troubling intelligence reports. He receives from many different sources intelligence that the Germans were intending to attack the Soviet Union. They were going to break the pact here. Now, Hitler supposedly had claimed, he'd said to Stalin, yes, I am moving more units into Poland, but I'm moving them out of range of British bombers because these are the units that we're going to use to invade England in the spring of 1941. So I'm just kind of moving all my units where they can't be affected by them, moving them into Poland where British bombers couldn't reach them. Stalin believed, okay, that may be true, but he also thought maybe the Germans were trying to kind of intimidate them, maybe scare them a little bit, so much so that Stalin was constantly making claims. They were both kind of competing diplomatically for influence in Bulgaria and Romania, and he kind of thought maybe this was a move by Hitler to tell him to back off of some of these claims. Soviet intelligence generally is very good. In fact, in this war, the Soviets are going to have really maybe the best intelligence service in the world, maybe. Kim Philby, who was the MI5 officer, MI5, MI6, I can't remember, the British Secret Service. He was head of the Soviet desk. He was in charge of spying on the Soviets for the British. He was a Soviet spy, right? The Soviets have spies everywhere because there's people everywhere that are convinced communism is a good thing, and they're closet communists, like Kim Philby. And his friends, Burgess, McLean, all these guys. And there's communists everywhere, so they're very easy to infiltrate. There are communists in the United States. Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department. I mean, there's communists everywhere, right? And they're reporting, they're giving intelligence to the Soviets, and of course there are many German spies, communist spies. However, despite all of this intelligence coming in to the Soviet Union, indicating that Hitler is going to shortly invade, Stalin refuses to believe it. Stalin refuses to believe that Hitler would actually betray him. He dismisses the intelligence as largely false flag operations instigated by the British to drive a wedge between the communists, between the Soviets and the Nazis. On paper, they're best friends, right? They're trading with each other, massive trading deals. They had agreed to split up Europe, so in theory, they're still really good friends. Hitler makes a decision sometime probably in the fall of 1940 that he wants to, despite the fact that he hadn't completely won the war in the West, Britain was still a belligerent, that he would invade the Soviet Union. Now, ideology always matters to Hitler, and he is a convinced National Socialist. He created National Socialism, which is one of the fundamental pillars of is anti-communism. Now, we talked about how initially he intended to invade in May of 1941, but Mussolini, he had his adventures in the Balkans that don't quite work out, so he has to go bail out Mussolini in the Balkans. But he's convinced that he's going to win. He's convinced he's going to win. He's convinced it's going to be a relatively short campaign. By the end of summer, the Soviet Union will fall. After all, everybody believed France had a much more powerful army than the Soviets, and France fell in about 6 weeks. And further, Germany had won the war against Russia in 1918, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It had beat Russia in World War I, and in World War I, Germany did not have panzer divisions, right? So there's a lot of optimism that Hitler has that he can take out the Soviet Union here. But he failed to acknowledge what a war with the Soviet Union would really mean for Germany. Now remember, in World War I, really, arguably more than anything, what defeated Germany was they couldn't import anything, right? The British had a blockade. They couldn't import food. 750,000 Germans die in World War I from starvation, right? They can't import stuff. There's no way to get stuff into Germany, right? World War II, when it starts, that's not an issue because we can get whatever we want through the Soviets. We're trading with the Soviets left and right. We need something. We just say to the Soviets, hey, we want to make a deal. So we'd say, okay. They get something out of it. So when the war starts, they're not really worried about trade and the economics of war in that sense. But the problem is, if you attack the Soviets, we lose that. We lose that economic, those things we need to procure. We're not going to have easy ways to procure them without the Soviets. Also, too, Germany's numbers do not match the numbers of the Soviets. The Soviets have far, far more people there. The Soviets can sustain losses that the Germans simply couldn't, and losses in manpower. And again, as I just mentioned, Hitler is only really considering the dismal performance of the Red Army in Finland. He's not considering they actually proved themselves quite skillful at Khalkhin Gol in the summer of 1939. The fact of the matter is, Germany needs to win this war fast. If Germany is brought into a war of attrition with the Soviet Union, it will lose the war. It cannot fight a war of attrition. It will lose. They needed to win the war by the end of the year. They need to win the war by the end of 1941. Everything depends on it. Everything depends on it. So the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So you can see this is pretty much everywhere that's either under German control or allied to Germany here in 1941. That's a big chunk of territory. That's nothing to spit at, right? That's quite strong. And again, all of these natural resources that Germany needs to fight a war, they're just flooding in from the Soviets. There's that old saying, you don't fight wars with people you trade with. Well, Germany and Russia are each other's biggest trading partners here. 1914, Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners. So, trade perhaps makes it less likely you'll go to war with somebody, but not impossible, certainly. Germany is getting at this time fuel, grain, cotton, various metals. The cotton was actually, they don't grow cotton in Russia. They're getting their cotton from China. They're actually getting their cotton from China and China and India and sending it to the Germans. Over the course of the pact, the USSR sent Germany 26,000 tons of chrome, and 140,000 tons of tin, and over 2 million tons of oil. Over 2 million tons of oil. Now, again, this is all given in exchange primarily for German technology. Blueprints for battleships, for factories, for other industrial projects. And in the fall of 1940, Ribbentrop had a goal. Now, this is before Hitler's completely made up his mind here. Ribbentrop is trying desperately to convince the Soviets to join the war on Germany's side. Okay? So Ribbentrop is trying to convince the Soviets to join the war on Germany's side. But the Soviets are kind of looking at the math, and they're saying, how does this benefit us? How does a war with Britain really fundamentally benefit us? And, of course, the Germans are saying, well, the British are in Iran. You can take over Iran. Hell, you can take over India. We don't care. You know? But this stuff doesn't seem terribly realistic to the Soviets. As I say, they're having tremendous disagreements over the Balkans, about who should have more influence in countries like Bulgaria and Romania. And also, too, as I mentioned, Germany was very friendly with Finland. And when the Soviets invade Finland, that kind of strained relations between them as well. In fact, there's an anecdote, I think it was around Christmas of 1940, December of 1940. Ribbentrop and Molotov are having a discussion about Russia coming into the war. And Molotov was visiting Berlin. And suddenly the air raid sirens go. It's a British bombing raid. So Ribbentrop and Molotov are hustled down into a bunker. Well, while they're in this bunker, Ribbentrop is still doing his best salesman pitch to get him in there and saying, look, we're going to win the war. It's just a matter of time. Look at how powerful Germany is. Look at how relatively weak England is. We're going to win the war. We're going to win the war, and it's going to happen soon. And Molotov famously said something to the effect of, well, if you're winning, why are we in a bomb shelter right now? Right? So they knew they weren't going to win. They knew the Germans weren't going to win. On March 30th, 1941, after Hitler had made the decision, on March 30th, 1941, Hitler actually addresses his generals in a top-secret meeting. And these are the various commanders that are going to actually command units going into Russia. He said, quote, "This is a war of extermination. Commanders must be prepared to sacrifice their personal scruples." Hitler tells them one of our greatest assets in this war is famine. We will literally starve people to death. And that will help us. That'll help us clear out, again, this racial Untermenschen. So expected approximately 30 million people in the Soviet Union to starve from in the war. He said the few Slavs that remain will essentially be slaves, will be German slaves. He says German settlers will settle the region, right? Again, this is in line with autarky and Lebensraum. German settlers, colonists, will settle Russia. And the few Slavs that remain, they will literally be slaves to us. He said, what we'll do is we'll post road signs, and we will teach these indigenous Russians, we will teach them just enough to know to stay off the road so we don't run them over, and that's all the education they'll get. And they'll just be farmers. They'll farm for us, right? Now, his view of this post-war colonization of Russia, he's basing this on the British model. Specifically, the British in India. The way the British administered India. Now, in India, you have, of course, millions of native Indians there. Millions of native Indians in India. The British ruled that entire subcontinent with about 40,000 administrators and bureaucrats. With about 40,000 administrators and bureaucrats, they ruled millions of people. And he says, that's what we're going to do in Russia. Russia's going to be our India, right? And this is the essence of Hitler's idea here of Lebensraum. Now, the German army, any questions so far? A German army will assemble three large army groups. So again, each of these army groups has about 2 or 3 field armies within it. We have Army Group North, which will be projected to go toward Leningrad. It will go through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. He will have Army Group Center, which will go straight toward Moscow. and then Army Group South, which will head toward Rostov and then the Caucasus and the oils of the Caucasus there. Now, typically, historically, you separate your army and then you concentrate it for battle. But what Hitler's going to do is he's going to say each of these army groups can independently take their objectives. So they're actually spreading out. They're actually going to spread out here. They each have their goals, and they're told you have to reach your objectives by the end of summer. Now, again, they're going to launch this in June 22, saying by the end of summer, we need to reach our objectives. The Germans will deploy for this attack. The Germans will deploy 3.8 million men. 3.8 million men. This is the largest military force ever assembled in history to that point. The largest military force ever assembled in history to that point. 3.8 million men. But again, this is not just Germans. We have about 300,000 Romanians. 300,000 Romanians. 400,000 Finns. And soon we will be joined by Hungarians, Slovaks, Italians, even Spanish volunteers will take part in this war. So with all of these allies, ultimately we'll get up to nearly 4.5 million people will engage in this operation. Again, too, the Germans have one of their armed services now is the Waffen-SS. The Waffen-SS. Now, we know the SS, under Heinrich Himmler, causing all sorts of problems. But the Waffen-SS is a military force. Literally, this is the armed SS. The armed SS. And they have their own tanks and artillery and, of course, men. They form their own panzer divisions. They're going to have their own panzer divisions. Now, to give you an idea of the scale, because we've been talking about what's going on in Africa. So we got, with all the Allied stuff here, nearly 4.5 million men. The Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel has about 40,000 men. Okay? So that's a sideshow compared to Russia, okay? The Germans amass for this operation, about 3,000 tanks, about 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. By contrast, the Red Army here. The Red Army in June of 1941 had about 6 million troops. 6 million troops. But the problem is, the Soviet Army, with those 6 million, has to police and protect the borders of a country that is kind of the biggest in the world in terms of geographic area, right? So those 6 million are spread out throughout Russia. They're spread out throughout Russia. Now, as I mentioned, too, the Soviets actually have a lot of equipment. A lot of it is outdated. But the Red Army boasts, here at the outset of the war, 25,000 tanks, compared to 3,000 German tanks. 25,000 tanks. Now, again, most of these are old, inferior, obsolete, but they're there. 2,500 tanks. And they have just under 1,900 aircraft. Again, most of these aircraft are like biplanes from World War I era, but 1,900 aircraft. They do have over 120,000 artillery pieces. And again, the one thing that the Soviets are really good at, the Russians have been really good at in World War I, is artillery. They're really good when it comes to artillery. But like I say, the vast majority of these tanks, these planes, are obsolete. They're old, they're obsolete. They do have things like we mentioned the T-34 tank, which is actually a really good tank. The Soviet air crews are fairly poorly trained and led. The Germans unquestionably have a much greater edge when it comes to technology. German equipment and technology is very good. Further, the German army, by 1941, has much more experience. They've now been fighting this war. They've been fighting this war for 2.5 years, right? Well, pardon me, just shy of 2 years. They've been fighting this war for just shy of 2 years. The Germans know how to fight. They know how to do war. The leadership, their generals, at least here initially, are better because they've had these experiences. They're better trained. And they think alike. The German general staff essentially created ways for, if a commander here sees a problem and a commander here sees a problem, they're both going to come up with the same solution because they've been trained to think that way, right? Which is a very good thing generally, although it will kind of also lead to some problems. There are also significant logistical considerations for the Germans because these three large army groups, as they move into Russia, they're going to have to be fed and provisioned. They're going to have to be fed and provisioned. As I say, we got all these horses. We got an army of horses. They've got to be fed, right? All the supplies, food is going to be competing for train space with oil, ammunition, the multitude of parts you need to keep tanks moving, and airplanes flying. So this practical desire to keep the army fed, it kind of meshes perfectly with Hitler's racial ideas here, right? And so what he tells, what the German army, because the German army, like I said, they're not really good at logistics. So they tell their people, they tell the soldiers, the armies, live off the land, steal from the peasants, take whatever you need from these farms, they're yours. That's how you're going to get fed. We're not going to have a regular supply train to feed you. You're going to feed what you can find in Russia. So, you tend to think of the German army as this highly mechanized, efficient machine, but the fact of the matter is, it has significant shortcomings. It has very significant shortcomings. And the first and arguably the most important is, they can't have a supply train to keep the people fed. But this doesn't matter to Hitler because these people that we're going to be fighting are Untermenschen. They can die, no great loss. And then this also meshes, too, with anti-communism, right? They're communists. Their ideology is poison. So here you have Hitler's racial gobbledygook and his political gobbledygook kind of meshing, as I say, with the practical desire to keep his army fed. And it all comes together here, and it's just going to be absolutely disastrous. Incidentally, one of the... So like I say, you have all these people telling Stalin the Germans are going to invade, You had deserters literally crossing the lines and saying, hey, we're preparing to invade you. And Stalin was just rejecting these things left and right. And there was one guy in Japan. He's a German in Japan. His name is Richard Sorge. And he was a journalist. And he worked for a German paper, but he was like a foreign correspondent in Japan. And he was actually a Soviet spy. And he would talk to these Japanese officials who had just talked to German officials, and they knew Germany was going to attack, and they let him know. So he was sending these notes frantically back to the Soviet Union saying, the Germans are attacking you. They're going to attack you. And Stalin simply refused to heed that. He didn't believe that. The invasion of the USSR. We can state, looking back, there's essentially three phases to this invasion over the course here of the year. The first phase, we begin the invasion on June 22nd, 1941. The early morning hours, as you can see, it starts right where we divided Poland, right down the center of Poland. And this phase takes place from 22 June to about 9 July. And this is where the German advance is the fastest. And in a matter of weeks, the Germans occupy Belarus and the Baltic states. And the Soviet Union, it's a sucker punch. They're reeling from it. One of the problems, too, is Stalin was trying to show the Germans how powerful he was. He was putting a lot of his military forces right on the front line, which was very stupid. You want to have the bulk of them back to be able to respond. But because they're so far forward, virtually all of that forward defensive air power was destroyed on the airfields on the first day. They lose all their aircraft in the Western Front on the first day, on the Eastern Front. And they just generally are outclassed across the board here in these first few weeks. But toward the end of this first phase, Hitler and his generals begin a very important disagreement. And the disagreement is, we're moving so fast and we're and victory must be assured, but what should be our operational objectives? What exactly should be our operational objectives? The generals say Moscow must take priority. We need to take Moscow. It is the capital. But Hitler, he is thinking, well, yeah, but is it strategically as important as the oil reserves and natural resources from down here, and arguably up in the north? Hitler kind of believed we should favor the flanks, and in particularly the south flank, and this is going to be a very, as I say, important disagreement that's going to happen. This will at times pause the advance. In fact, through much of August, the armies will not be making that much headway at all. And this is why one of the reasons why people say that delay that Mussolini forced the Germans to take when they went into the Balkans is not that significant, because here Hitler actually ends up wasting about a month of August, right? Phase 2 takes place between early July to the end of the September, and this is where that argument really comes to fruition. The generals want to take Moscow. Hitler wants to take Leningrad and the Ukraine in the south. And then phase 3, after they kind of make a decision here, they engage in Operation Typhoon. And Operation Typhoon will be the German push on Moscow. The German push on Moscow. They try to do it all. They don't make it. They don't just say we're going for Moscow. They're trying to do too much with too little here. Now, the invasion is, as much as blitzkrieg is a real thing here, as much as these tactics are more real than myth, they advance quite far. This, of course, is not Russia. This is a great map. This is, I think, in Life magazine or Time magazine. What you can see here is this is illustrating if the Germans had attacked from the west coast, how far they would have gotten into the United States if the United States were Russia, right? So it's a way for Americans to kind of see what is happening here, exactly the devastation that is being wrought there. And you'll notice that each of these American cities have Soviet names beneath them. Salt Lake is Omsk. Kubashiev is Omaha. You'll notice Pittsburgh is Smolensk, right? Philadelphia is Lvov. But so it's just kind of an interesting idea of looking at the war, and an interesting way for the Americans to look at the war and kind of understand just how devastating this is. Boy, I mean, that's still debated hotly today, because here's the thing. You know, Hitler was thinking, well, you're thinking like 19th century, we capture the capital, that's game, set, and match, but that's not the case. We need to go after natural resources. Strategically, arguably that was correct, but what Hitler didn't account for was Moscow was also a major transportation center. And if it was kind of a spider web that tied a lot of the rest of the country together. So if they'd taken that out, the Soviets could not have efficiently moved units around. So maybe that would have been the key there too. So I don't know if there's a right answer, right? So, of course, we have these blitzkrieg tactics. They're working just like advertised. By the end of the second phase, the Red Army had lost about 2 million men. The Red Army had lost about 2 million men. The Germans had encircled Leningrad in the north. They never take Leningrad, but they encircle Leningrad in the north. They take Kiev and most of Ukraine, which is, of course, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, right, where most of the farms are. And the Luftwaffe, as I say, decimates the Air Force. 4,000 planes, 4,000 Red Army planes are destroyed on the first day. 4,000 planes on the first day, most of them on the ground. 90% of Soviet tanks that were deployed on this front are destroyed in the first week of the war. 90% of Soviet tanks deployed on that front are destroyed in the first week of the war. On paper, the Germans are doing great. When they take Kiev and they take Minsk, they're doing big encirclements, right? They encircle the enemy, and then you have these shrinking pockets where the enemy is just they're surrounded, they're just trying to hold out before they're completely destroyed. But the German time frame immediately is off because they don't expect as much resistance. Despite the fact that they are taking these cities, it's still, in some of these cities, they're holding out in these pockets longer than they anticipated they would, because the Soviets tend to be pretty fierce fighters. And again, they're fighting for their homes, right? They're fighting for their homeland here. Now, within these three army groups, you also have kind of panzer groups, larger formations that are made up of panzer divisions, right? Panzer armies, panzer groups. And so we have, going into Russia here, a total of 30 panzer divisions. 30 panzer divisions. So we've been busy, right? When the war starts, we have far fewer panzer divisions. Now we have 30 panzer divisions. But again, let me stress this, the bulk of the German army is moving just like their fathers moved into Russia in 1914. They're big infantry armies. They've got horsebound supply trains. Same things that like I said, their fathers did. Most of the hard fighting in this war that the Germans engage in is done by those panzer divisions. They are the tip of the spear, right? They're the ones that are moving very quickly. So as these units are facing the bulk of the fighting, they are taking the bulk of the casualties. You're losing, of course, the weapons. You're losing the tanks and the artillery pieces. But you're also losing trained tankers and people that know, experienced tankers, people that know how to fight. They're dropping off left and right as they're moving forward because they're the tip of the spear here. To give you an idea here, when the Germans take Minsk in Belarus, the panzer divisions were 300 miles ahead of the regular infantry. Now, they have their own motorized infantry with them, but it's not a lot, right? But they're so far ahead that they're the guys that are going to come up and support them are 300 miles behind them, right? The Soviets, too, also, because they can't stand up very easily against the Germans at this point, they engage increasingly in irregular warfare. So you have Soviet partisans pop up behind the lines, and they're causing all sorts of problems with German supply and logistics here. You also have just these tanks and these trucks. They're being just used to the extent of their ability, so they're breaking down. They're breaking down left and right. The tanks, most German tanks, were built for the terrain and the roads of Central Europe. The terrain and the roads of Central Europe, the tanks and trucks. And they're not used to, a lot of these are dirt roads, muddy roads. As soon as it gets in the fall and the rain starts, they become very muddy. And in fact, you have this very high level of attrition in your tanks through non-combat. It was much higher than it had been in Western Europe. A lot of tanks are failing. They have nothing to do with combat. They're just the conditions they're in are terrible. In some cases, these Germans can fix these problems themselves, but in a lot of cases they can't, and they need specialists to do it. Blitzkrieg warfare absolutely depended on keeping your tanks, your planes, filled with ammo, filled with gasoline, and filled with all the parts that make them work. It doesn't really allow for these breakdowns in logistics and supply over these vast distances in Russia. It just doesn't allow for that. It demands quick victories, and then it works. But the victories take longer. If it's attritional, these tactics are not really going to work, right? All right, real quickly, we'll do the Battle of Smolensk. Casualties on both sides are mounting. Now, we have the Battle of Smolensk here. And this is, of course, the site of a famous battle between Napoleon and the Russian army in 1812. During the Battle of Smolensk, the Germans lost about 150,000 troops. 150,000 troops, killed, captured, wounded, missing. Compared to the Soviets, who lost 600,000 troops, killed, captured, wounded, missing. But again, even though the Soviets are taking far more losses, they can much more easily absorb those losses. They have manpower that can replace them. Now, the Chief of Staff of the Army at this point, after Ludwig Beck resigned in 1938, the Chief of Staff of the Army is this guy, Franz Halder. And Franz Halder, on August 2nd, he wrote in his diary, quote, "In the situation as a whole, it is becoming ever clearer that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. At the outset of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we are already counting 360. These divisions are certainly not armed and equipped in our sense of the words, and tactically they are often poorly led. But there they are, and when a dozen of them have been destroyed, the Russians put up another dozen." It's kind of like zombies, right? You kill zombies, they just keep coming. It's the same thing here. They're killing all these Russians. And I don't mean to be flippant. But when you kill these Russians, and they just keep coming. There are just so many of them. They just keep coming here. At the same time, the tool that Germany uses to fight this war, that it has always, for the last 2 years, used to fight this war. Their panzer divisions, it's not working. It's not working like it used to work. Yes, it can gain power. I mean, it can gain land and it can gain victories. Brief, tactical, operational victories, but they can't translate that into strategic success. They can't translate it into strategic success. So this battle at Smolensk, it's a strong indication to the Germans right here, maybe we won't be successful because the cost associated with taking this objective was just so great. The cost associated with taking this objective was just so great. By December, the Wehrmacht had lost 50% of its tanks. By December, the Wehrmacht had lost 50% of its tanks. So its striking power, again, the tool with which Germany is waging its war, is being diminished. It is losing momentum. As soon as the Germans declare war on the Soviet Union, or launch their sneak attack, as it were, it's funny, too, because when they launch their attack, like simultaneously, about the same time they're launching the attack, or a little bit after, the German ambassador in Moscow, I think his name was von Schulberg, if I remember correctly, Schulenberg, he went to the Soviet Foreign Ministry and he handed Molotov essentially the declaration of war. And Molotov famously said, "We did not deserve this." Molotov said, "We did not deserve this." And Schulenberg just kind of sheepishly walked out. He knew what was going on, and he understood what was happening. But as soon as the Germans invade, we have this massive patriotic response to defend the country from the Soviet peoples. And again, it's called the Great Patriotic War. Now, Soviet propaganda had always said that in the event that the Western powers invade the Soviet Union, we will stop them at the border. Remember, because Stalin's putting all of his units right on the border. We'll stop them at the border, and then we'll counterattack and drive the enemy back into their homeland. That was always the party line here of the Soviet Union. The Soviet people believed this. But now Soviet propaganda has to change tack. Again, as I say, they dub it the Great Patriotic War to try to stir up patriotic feeling, which again is in and of itself is somewhat anti-communist, right? I mean, well, contrary to Marxist ideas. Because in Marxism, as you build toward true communism, the state withers away. You get rid of the state. But here you are, the Soviets, in this crisis, in this emergency, emphasizing the state, right? Trying to build love for the state. Millions of men and women volunteer. They go to they go into the army, and again, like I say, millions of women. They're going to have the Soviet army will probably have the largest ratio of women serving in their armed services of any belligerent in the war. Many women had been given, along with men in the years leading up to the war. Many women had received rudimentary military training as part of their general education. General education in the Soviet Union, part of it was kind of military education. Women had received this too. Nevertheless, initially, right at the very beginning, a lot of women are turned down for military service. Right at the beginning, they're turned down for military service. And then increasingly, as the need for manpower increases, you realize there's a lot of jobs in the military, at least that's the assumption, there's a lot of jobs in the military that men are doing behind the lines that women could do. And so why not put women in those positions? We can move the men to the front line. But then ultimately we will see more and more women are engaged in combat operations themselves. They will be fighting. Many women will ultimately be fighting soldiers in this war. Ultimately, more than 1 million women will fight in the Red Army during the Second World War. More than 1 million women will fight in the Red Army during the war. And again, like I say, it's not just in those service roles. The British Army and the American Army will all employ women, but it will be largely in service roles. They will not be in combat roles. The Soviet Union is really the only major belligerent to use large numbers of women in combat roles. Now, as soon as this breaks out, and we see the stunning success of the Wehrmacht. And, of course, it's not apparent to Germany's enemies that the Wehrmacht is suffering these kinds of losses and logistical issues and whatnot. Those things aren't apparent to their enemies. And it begins to look increasingly to the British and the Americans and other observers around the world that the USSR, its days are numbered. It looks like it will fall within a very short time. After the initial invasion in June, most people are thinking within a few months, certainly by the end of the year, the Soviet Union will be forced to sue for peace or will be completely destroyed. Well, now, of course, tensions between Moscow and London throughout the era of the Nazi-Soviet pact were quite tense. And there was a great fear that sooner or later the Soviets might join the war on the side of the Germans. But immediately the Soviets reach out to the British. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, and they start to make a working arrangement. In fact, like I say, Churchill himself is very eager. This is something he's always believed would happen. It's something he had hoped for, and he sees something of a delivery for the British in this invasion. And of course, Churchill gives up and he gives a speech in the House of Commons. He says, "No one's been a more implacable opponent of communism than I have," and gives a speech. He says, "But here we've got this common enemy. We've got to work together." And he actually said later, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would have made a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, right? Just to kind of emphasize how much he hated the Germans. But there was opposition in Britain and America to helping the Soviets, because of course the Soviets are not good guys either. This regime, as we know, is an evil, murderous, barbaric regime. And so there's a lot of resistance to helping them among the Western democracies. There was a perception in many quarters that the Soviets were just as bad as the Nazis. And since the USSR was about to fall anyway, why should we help them? Why should we send weapons or help to the Soviets if the Soviet Union's going to fall and those weapons will just fall into the hands of the Germans anyway? It doesn't make sense for a lot of people here. Now, America, as we know, had begun Lend-Lease shipping to Britain beginning in the spring of 1941, okay? As soon as this happens, Roosevelt makes the decision to extend Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. So we begin to ship supplies to the Soviets. Harry Truman, of course, later destined to become president at the end of the war, he was a senator at this point in Missouri. And Harry Truman famously said, "We should give the Soviets as much weapons as they need, and then as soon as they start winning and the Germans are on the defensive, we should give the Germans as much weapons as they can, and then just let them fight it out, and then those two evil regimes will just kill each other off." That was Harry Truman's solution here initially. Bless you. But there are practical problems about getting supplies to the Soviet Union. It's relatively easy to supply Britain. You've just got to dodge some U-boats in the Atlantic, but it's kind of, right there. But getting supplies to Russia is going to prove a lot more difficult. The Germans dominate the Baltic Sea, so you can't really ship things through the Baltic Sea, obviously. So American and British ships, one of the chief routes to supply the Soviets is what they called the Murmansk Run. The Murmansk Run. Murmansk is a city kind of, I think, above the Arctic Circle here. And essentially, you would have to send cargo ships above Scandinavia, north of Scandinavia, and you can't do this year-round because it freezes a lot. You'd have to send them north of Scandinavia, where then they could find their way to Murmansk. Now, the problem is, the Nazis, the Germans, dominate Norway. So German bombers are very active. German bombers would fly out of Norway. and try to interdict these cargo ships heading to Murmansk. Additionally, that's a lot more territory you would have to dodge U-boats under. So U-boats are a problem. So this is very, very dangerous. And of course, this is just absolutely freezing water. If your ship goes down north of Scandinavia, you're not going to last 20 minutes in the water. You'll be dead, okay? You'll die from the cold. The other route to attempt to supply Russia is through Vladivostok. The problem is Vladivostok is right next to Japan. How can you easily get goods there? And what will be interesting is frequently the United States will ship supplies to Vladivostok, and the Japanese will avoid, the Japanese will avoid sinking these ships. And that's because the Japanese and the Soviets in April of 1941 signed a non-aggression pact, and they will actually honor it. Japan and the Soviet Union will not fight each other until the last 3 days of the war. Okay? They will not fight each other until the last, 6 days of the war, I guess. Last 6 days of the war. And so the Japanese were scared if they attacked American ships taking goods to Russia, that would bring the Soviets in on the war against them, and they didn't want that. There were also routes that were attempted through Iran into Russia that way. But my point is, in order to get material to Russia, geography is one of the Allies' greatest enemies here, right? Just the geography is just incredibly bad. But in 1941, the British will succeed in delivering, and these are largely British convoys. Americans would ship stuff to Britain, and usually Britain would organize the convoys to Russia. In 1941, the British will deliver to the Russians 450 tanks. 450 tanks. It's not many. That's about a little more, about maybe a panzer division and a half, an armored division and a half. But at least 90 of them were used in the Battle of Moscow. So they will be of some help here. These supplies are not critical at this point, but they do help. They're not critical at this point, but they do help. Much more valuable supplies of food and raw materials will begin to pour into Russia as time goes by. And increasingly what we will see is the great Soviet victories of late 42, 43, 44. They will absolutely be contingent upon Western supplies and Western materials, Western trucks, all sorts of things here. Now, the Soviets themselves make some pretty critical decisions here at the beginning of the war. And arguably, the most important decision that the Soviets make in the first days of the war is they realize the Germans are advancing rapidly. Now, the most industrialized part of the Soviet Union at this time is the western part of the Soviet Union, European part of the Soviet Union, right? And what they're going to do is they're actually going to evacuate Soviet industry east of the Ural Mountains. So the Urals are to the east of Moscow. They are literally going to tear down factories and then reassemble them in these little makeshift tent city villages in the middle of nowhere, but far enough away from German attacks and German bombings that they can provide a steady flow of material. In total, the Soviets broke down and moved about 2,500 factories. About 2,500 factories are disassembled and reassembled east of the Urals. About 1,500 of them were major armament factories, building tanks, planes, small arms, other things you need to fight there. Some of them are evacuated very far east, all the way into Siberia. Many of them are evacuated into Siberia. And it's not, and you can't just evacuate, obviously, the factories themselves. You also have to evacuate the personnel. So about 30 to 40% of all Soviet engineers living in European Russia are evacuated eastward to oversee the creation, the rebuilding of these factories and the smooth operation of these factories once they're up and running. They were not conscripted. They were not thrown into the army. So if you had technical expertise when it came to factories or engineering and stuff like that, if you had an education, you did not fight. You were needed elsewhere, and you were sent to these factories here. In total, this process of evacuating industry, you can't just evacuate, again, the factories, it's the people, right? Not just engineers, but the workforce. So in total, about 16 million people, 16 million people will be evacuated from European Russia to east of the Ural Mountains to run these factories here. Among these 60 million evacuated are Jews, millions of Russian Jews and Soviet Jews. Now, the Jews in Russia, you had many of them tended to be more educated. There's an emphasis, as we know, in the Jewish religion and society on education. Many of them tended to be people who were educated, and so many of them had a lot of technical training and technical expertise. Yeah. And a lot of them are given then positions, like managerial positions, in these factories to oversee them. Certainly, there were plenty of ethnic Russians that had those positions as well, but Jews were a major factor, a major group here involved in this relocation. Now, this whole process of tearing down factories, moving them to the east, rebuilding them, staffing them, finding the engineers to run them, this whole process is under the authority of the NKVD, the secret police. This illustrates how important this was considered to the state. The secret police is in charge of this operation. Not the army, not the party bureaucracy, but the NKVD. You got to break these factories down, as I say, bit by bit. You got to put them on trains. You got to find the trains. You got to schedule the trains. You have to find, a place that has access to water, and if you need raw materials, ideally something that you can do there. It also has to be a place that you can build rail access to. You have to build a place so you have rail access. As I say, many of these cities that pop up are tent cities. No, I don't have it there. They're tent cities. They're just tent cities that pop up here. It's also costly. This costs a lot of money to do this. This is not cheap. But it will pay major dividends. It was absolutely the right move to make for the Soviets. It's absolutely the right war to make for the Soviets. And so this is going to play a critical role as the war progresses. Not just in what it will eventually pay out to the Russians, but also, too, critically, in what it denies the Germans. A lot of places that otherwise could have been occupied by the Germans, and had the Germans still used it to, if nothing else, machine shops for repairs and stuff, it would have been a help for them. But they deny those resources, those factories, to the Germans. By 1943, Soviet military output will match German military output. By 1943, Soviet military output will match German military output. The Soviets will, of course, just mass produce these military goods, and they will be essential, of course, ultimately to Soviet victory. But the Soviets take other steps here. The Soviet working day is expanded to 13 hours. Soviet working day is expanded to 13 hours. You are expected to work 13 hours a day. There's no such thing as holidays. You don't take holidays. Workers work 7 days a week. So you work 7 days a week, 13 hours a day, if you're a worker in one of these factories. Additionally, the entire country is put into a state of martial law. Martial law. Now, this is a legitimate emergency. But I say the entire state is put under martial law. The fact of the matter is the Soviet Union was kind of always under martial law, right? There was always, and by that what I mean is it's a police state where you do what you're told or else. But here where we introduce martial law, the army is given more and more authority, particularly in sectors near the front, to control the civilian population. Stalin gave a speech toward the beginning of the war here in which he says, shirkers, people that are not doing their work, or complainers will be shot. So if you're not too happy about working 13 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're too vocal about it, you're not going to last too long. Where in much of the country, a lot of industry was under kind of the bureaucratic civilian control of the Communist Party, now all military production, all production virtually, is placed under military control. The military is running production here. Now, there's another factor here too. Now, as we know, the Soviet dogma, communist dogma, is fundamentally atheist, right? Communist dogma states there is no God. And yet, despite that, many, many, many people in Russia are still deeply religious. They're still deeply religious. When the Russian Revolution happens, there was this kind of... One of the ways the Soviets kind of tried to stamp out religion was to try to humiliate people that still had religious beliefs. Oh, you're like a child. Do you still believe in God? Oh my gosh, this idea of humiliating people that believed in the idea of God. Now, suddenly with the war, Stalin makes greater allowances for religious observance. He wants people behind him. The churches are penetrated by NKVD agents, so they're being watched here. But the Soviets kind of say, you know what? It's a good thing to go to a church and say a prayer for the motherland, right? It's a good thing to say a prayer for victory, right? Soviet propaganda begins to refer to Russia as Holy Russia. Holy Russia. Holy is not a word in the communist lexicon, right? But they're referring to Russia as Holy Russia. Stalin was never a great speaker like Hitler was a great speaker. Stalin kind of rose to power kind of, behind the scenes. And he gives some speeches initially, they're not that great. But increasingly, as the war goes on, he gives speeches that actually sound more and more sincere. He says that we're in an emergency and we all have to work together in order to see us through this. He says all comrades are brothers and sisters and we all need to do our part. So Stalin, one of these absolutely bloodthirsty tyrants, he's retreating through a lot of his hard communist stances in order to kind of create a better kind of create more unity in prosecuting this war. There's also propaganda is looking back toward the Napoleonic Wars and how Napoleon was expelled from Russia. And there's a lot of Soviet propaganda that show the great generals like Kuznetsov and all these guys and all these other Soviet generals or Russian generals that forced out the French. And there's even kind of a rehabilitation of some, like I said, those Russian generals, but a rehabilitation of other figures in Russian history that were certainly not communists, because communism didn't exist in the day. And communist propaganda had always been, these people were exploiters, they were nobles, aristocrats, they're evil, they're horrible. But now a lot of these figures start to be, as I say, rehabilitated. And this actually process begins even slightly before Russia enters the war. There was a great Soviet filmmaker named Sergei Eisenstein. And Eisenstein, he made Battleship Potemkin, which was this dramatization of events that happened before the revolution that showed how evil the Tsar was. But he made this film called Alexander Nevsky. And Alexander Nevsky was a Russian prince who expelled I think it was the Swedes, if memory serves, from Russia. He expelled the enemy from Russia. And here now they're elevating him. They're showing that he's this great hero, even though again he was a he was a royal, which is kind of, leaves a nasty taste in most communists' mouths, right? Well, the Soviet system of terror and repression remains throughout the war. But Stalin realizes very soon, Stalin's attitude was, if you want people to work hard, you grab one person, you shoot him, and you say, you work hard or this is you. And what he finds is that's not really a great motivator in this war where people are going to probably go to their certain deaths anyway fighting the enemy. And even when officers lose battles, they gain experience. They're less likely to make the same mistakes. In August of 1941, Stalin issues an order in which he says all Soviet soldiers who surrender are traitors. If you surrender to the enemy, you are a traitor. If you surrender to an enemy, you are a traitor. Further, he says, if you are a traitor, the sins of the children have to pay for the sins of the father. So your wives and children can be arrested if you surrender here. Wives would be sent to camps, children would be sent to orphanages. And these children would grow up knowing their father is a traitor, and they would be looked down upon and bullied largely because of that. And Stalin absolutely hated people that committed suicide. If you committed suicide, this goes back before the war, if you committed suicide, many people did. Many Soviet peoples committed suicide. They'd rather commit suicide than be tortured by Stalin and his cronies. And they'd rather commit suicide than see harm come to their families and whatnot. And Stalin hated people that committed suicide. He thought that was their way of trying to get beyond his control. Stalin had this real sadistic need to control everyone. And so that was obviously something that really he had a problem with as well, is that idea of suicide. Now this order saying that those that surrendered were traitors, it is not consistently implemented. Everybody that is surrendered, their families are not all arrested and sent to camps or orphanages. It's selectively implemented. But there was always the fear of most of these soldiers that if we screw up, if we are taken prisoner, we'll lose our families. We'll lose our families. Now, over the course of the war, over about 3 million Soviets will be taken prisoner. You just don't have the infrastructure to arrest all of their families and take care of them, right? So that's not going to happen. Soviet POWs. The Wehrmacht, as I say, in the initial months here, will capture hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs. They will capture hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs just in the first few months of the war. In Kiev, when the Soviets surround Kiev, when the Germans surround Kiev and the Soviets resist and eventually Kiev is captured, about 220,000 Soviet prisoners of war are captured. Okay, about 220,000 Soviets are captured there in the Kiev pocket. Now these prisoners, these Soviet prisoners, they are kept in hellish conditions where their basic needs are rarely met. Most of the time, the Germans simply do not feed large numbers of their Soviet prisoners. They simply do not feed them. Here you can see in this photograph there on the right, you can see these are just boxcars, open boxcars, with people just kind of crowded in there. And that's where they're kept. All right, all day in the sun. Now, there was a German civil servant. His name was Xavier Dorsch. Xavier Dorsch. And he actually visited a Soviet POW camp near Minsk in July. So in July 41, he visits this camp. And he reports, quote, the prisoners are packed so tightly together in this area that they can hardly move and they have to relieve themselves where they stand. They are guarded by a company-sized unit of active soldiers. The small size of the guard unit means that it can only control the camp by using the most brutal level of force. The problem of feeding the prisoners of war is virtually insoluble. Some of them have been without food for 6 to 8 days. This is just miserable. By the end of 1941, 300,000 Soviet prisoners in German custody have died. these were, before June 22nd, 1941, healthy men. And yet, by the end of 1941, 300,000 die, mostly from starvation, malnutrition, mistreatment. Now, during the entire course of the war, during the entire course of World War II, Germany will take 5.7 million Soviets as prisoners. 5.7 million Soviets as prisoners. Estimates state that as many as 3.3 million die in German custody. Estimates say that as many as 3.3 million die in German custody. That is a death rate of 58%. If you are taken prisoner by the Germans, there's a better than 50% chance you're going to die. Okay, you're not going to survive the war. Death rate of 58%. Now, by contrast to that, over the course of the war, the Soviets will take about 2 million German prisoners. The Soviets will take about 2 million German prisoners. Of that number, only 356,687 died. 356,687 died. That is a death rate of only 18%. That is a death rate of only 18%. So you're much more likely to be a Soviet prisoner and die in German custody than be a German prisoner and die in Soviet custody. Now, let me be clear. Many of the Germans that are captured in World War II will stay in the Soviet Union until 1955. There's not a general release of German prisoners until 1955. And they are living in hellish conditions. They are mistreated. It would not have been a happy place. But you were more likely to survive under the Soviets than under the Germans. Stalin micromanages the war effort. Okay? He micromanages the war effort. But not really in the same way that Hitler micromanages the war effort. They create something called the State Committee for Defense. The State Committee for Defense. And the State Committee for Defense is kind of like the British War Cabinet. It's a small group of men who are kind of the supreme authority over everything in the state for the emergency. And he, of course, is the head of the State Committee for Defense. Now, shortly, actually about a month or two before the German invasion, Stalin's title had always just been General Secretary of the Communist Party. He actually had held no state position. He held a party position. That's how he ruled, was by being the head of the party. And about a month or two before the German invasion, he actually becomes, essentially, I can't remember his exact title, but he actually becomes the prime minister. He actually takes on, for the first time, a state position prior to the German invasion. So he's already increasingly getting involved here in matters of state, but he takes on this role as head of the State Defense Committee, State Committee for Defense. Now, there's also another kind of important element here in the Red Army, and this is called Stavka. Stavka essentially is the supreme command of the military. The supreme command of the military. Now, I'm not 100% here, but as I understand it, that term Stavka, you could almost loosely define it as general staff, I guess. But Stavka had existed under the Tsars. But Stavka, I think there had been a Stavka, I want to say in the Napoleonic era, but don't quote me on that. But the idea of Stavka, the supreme kind of operational planning body of the army, had been around a while. And it comes into being when there are wars, essentially, and then it goes away after the wars, as I understand it. So Stavka is reconstituted here shortly after the Germans invade, and this is the supreme command of the military, so it reports directly to the State Defense Committee. So Stalin kind of dominates Stavka. Okay? He dominates Stavka through the State Defense Committee. He also, very often, issues orders directly to field armies in the field, Red Army field armies in the field. In 1941 and 1942, in fact, he will frequently demand counterattacks that the Red Army is simply not ready for, and very often these end in disaster. Sometimes they do slow down the Germans, but they don't really stop them. And frequently, Stalin does something here at the beginning of the war that Hitler will increasingly do as the war goes on, and that is Stalin continuously orders units. No, you can't surrender, but you can't retreat either. you have to hold your position. How can you hold your position when you run out of bullets? You've got a dozen men versus 100 men. I mean, you realistically can't. But so Stalin at the beginning of the war takes on this authority, tries to micromanage it, and what we learn is Stalin is no great military thinker. He's not a great military thinker. This is going to change as the war goes on. But here at the beginning of the war, he screws up again and again and again. Operation Typhoon. The Germans finally decide by October they're ready to launch a major attack against Moscow. They're going to launch a major assault against Moscow. And they dub this Operation Typhoon. Operation Typhoon. The battle begins on October 2nd, and the Germans will ultimately call it off on December 4th. The offensive began, we talked about the Battle of Smolensk last time, and this had been taken in July. So Smolensk is going to be kind of the staging ground. The area around Smolensk will be the staging ground for the attack on Moscow. Smolensk is about 186 miles from Moscow. So the Germans are going to have to cover 186 miles. Now, the Germans, as they start to move toward Moscow, so Smolensk is here, there's Moscow, they're moving in, you can see these Soviet pockets they're creating there. They're pushing in toward Moscow. Now, originally, they want to try to get around Moscow, right? They want to try to surround it and create a pocket in Moscow like they had created elsewhere. The problem is, when you're trying to make these big sweeping movements around instead of going straight at it, you're kind of lengthening your supply lines. It's harder to keep your units supplied as you're lengthening your lines here. And prior to the launch of Typhoon, from June 22nd until October here, the Germans had already lost about 300,000 men, and they had gone from that initial strength of about 3,000 tanks. They're down to about half that. They're down to about 1,500 tanks. They've gone from about 3,000 tanks to about 1,500 tanks on the eve of Operation Typhoon. Now, the commander in charge of Operation Typhoon is the leader of Army Group Center. This is Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Fedor von Bock. He's in charge of the drive to Moscow here. Now, Panzer Group Center. Remember, we got Panzer Group North heading toward Leningrad, Panzer Group South heading toward Rostov, and Panzer Group Center right in the middle. Well, in order to reinforce Panzer Group Center or Army Group Center for this drive, Panzer units from both North and South are temporarily given to Army Group Center. So we're reinforcing Army Group Center for this drive here. Bock gives his commanders, his subordinate commanders, an objective date. November 7th. He wants Moscow in German hands by November 7th. That's just over a month from the start of the offensive. So they've got just over a month to cover 186 miles and take the capital of the Soviet Union. Now, again, as is so often the case, the initial advance is successful. They start making really, really good headway. But even as they are advancing rapidly, as they're doing the calculations, they're realizing we're not on track to meet our November 7th date. We're not on track to meet it. Now, initially, too, one thing that helps out in these initial advances is when they start this attack, the weather is really, really good. The weather is really, really good. That's, of course, going to change here eventually. The Soviet formations, the Germans had, or the Soviets had two formations facing it. They had the Western Army Front and the Reserve Front are in front of Moscow trying to stem this tide. And the Germans believe they can destroy these two fronts before Moscow, then surround the city. But again, there are pockets that are developing. You have to keep guys in your rear area to keep these pockets from growing. And the fact that we have to devote so much to containing these pockets means it's drawing resources and manpower away from pushing at the front here, right? In fact, I think in all these pockets, you probably have a total of something like 700,000 men, which is a lot of guys you've got to keep an eye on, right? Because you can't, if you neglect them, they'll break out and cause problems in your rear areas, and you can't have that. Now, the Soviet leadership comes close to panicking when this happens, okay? On October 13th, Stalin orders all of the government to be evacuated from Moscow to the east. He orders the government to be evacuated. So suddenly you have like all of the important government papers and stuff. You've got to get those on trains, the archives, bureaucrats have to be moved out. All pretty much everything that makes the government function they begin the process of evacuating it to the east. The NKVD starts setting demolitions to prepare to blow up the Soviet metro, the underground train system, as well as other places around the country. The NKVD is rigging it to blow. Bakeries stop baking. I mean, people stop working because it's like, oh crap, what's going to happen? You almost have chaos breaking out among the people when they think Moscow is going to fall. Foreign embassies leave Moscow. They go east. It's a panic. People are absolutely panicking in Moscow. Looters and criminals take over the streets in Moscow for a time. Looters and criminals. The NKVD and the army have a hard time keeping order. Widespread plundering. Well-to-do people in the Communist Party who are kind of running things, they're assaulted and robbed on the street, sometimes beaten on the street. Stalin, who is preparing to leave the capital, he thinks better of it. And he says, as long as I'm in Moscow, I'm a symbol, and I can use that to try to get the people to fight harder. So Stalin ultimately decides to remain in Moscow. He sends the NKVD out on the street with full authority to shoot looters and to restore order. They do it. They go out with a ruthless efficiency. They restore order in a few hours. This is the closest point in the war to where it looked like Stalin could potentially lose control of the city here. They were also preparing. Now remember, November is October to the Russians, right? It's a different calendar. So they were actually preparing to celebrate their annual October Revolution parade. Stalin ordered the parade will go forward like every year. So they have the parade, these troops march through Moscow, and literally, as they march through the city, they keep marching right to the front. So they just literally march, they're battle ready, they're combat ready, and they march to the front. One thing I should mention too, just to kind of go back a little bit. When the Germans first invaded, Stalin went to headquarters and he's saying, okay, we need to attack, we need to contain this. And for a few days, he's given a lot of orders, and they're just not realistic, they're not being carried out. And then he just disappeared. And for a week, Stalin was incommunicado. He went back to his dacha in the country, and he was just there. Well, Molotov and some of these other leading communists, they decide, we need to get Stalin. We need leadership. So they actually go in this delegation, they go out to his dacha, and they see him there, and he's drunk, he's sitting on the floor, and when he sees these people come up, he asks them, why are you here? They thought they were coming to arrest him. That Stalin thought they were coming to arrest him. They thought that because he'd screwed up so badly in trusting Hitler, they were going to remove power. And they said, we need you. We need your help. And he's like, okay, I'll help. But there was a minute there where Stalin himself doubted his ability, doubted his position, and thought he might be arrested. Now, as I say, the operation starts out very well, and because again it was good weather. But very quickly, about halfway through October, it starts to get really cold really fast, and it starts to snow and to rain, and snow will melt. It snows at night, and then it melts when it's daytime. And what happens is all of that now wet snow and rain, it creates. Remember, most of the roads here are not paved; they're all dirt roads. It creates mud. So now we have this tremendous mud roads. And this is something that typically happened in spring and fall in Russia. And the Russians referred to this as the Rasputitsa. And which literally means the muddy weather. Or I shouldn't say literally, but it means something along those lines, the muddy weather, right? It is impossible to conduct blitzkrieg operations in weather conditions like this. It's impossible because, again, blitzkrieg operations depend on swiftness and fast-moving units. You just can't have that when instead of your blitzkrieg, your armor moving as fast as they can, you have to tow it out of the mud, right? Stalin brings in Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov, and gives Zhukov command of the defense of Moscow. Stalin gives Zhukov the command of the defense of Moscow. These are actually some Soviet AA gunners up there, and some German troops out in the snow. The Soviets, when this battle begins, when this campaign begins, the Soviets have 1.2 million men protecting Moscow. 1.2 million men. By the end of October, they're down to 90,000 men. Now, all the others were killed, captured, wounded, missing, right? This gives you an idea of just the apocalyptic level of battle that we're talking about here as the Germans are trying to take this city. The Germans... Now Zhukov is, as we know, Zhukov, he beat the Japanese at Kulkin Gol in 1939. Zhukov is very bright, and his plan is simple. The Germans cannot advance. They cannot make significant headway except on these relatively few main roads. Except on relatively few main roads. Their tanks will get stuck, so you got these choke points along the main roads. The Soviets identify what are the main roads the Germans can travel along, and what they do is they just mine the hell out of these roads. They position all of their artillery to focus on these roads, so that as soon as the Germans come down, they're going to have to deal with these minefields. They're going to have to deal with these constant artillery barrages, you know. Tanks are great things, but if you get a direct hit by an artillery shell, you're toast, you know. Now, additionally, too, as we mentioned, as much ground as the Germans take, it's that much more ground that their supply trains will have to cover, right? So logistical issues are a problem. How do we get stuff from railheads to the units? Well, with trucks. Guess what? Our trucks are just as susceptible to these muddy roads as are our tanks. So it's taking longer to get our food, our weapons, our ammunition, repair parts to our panzer divisions, even as they're moving further here. And also, too, one of the key things we need to keep this army going from the German point of view is gas. And the Germans are running out of gas. They're running out of gas at the front line where they need it. Each panzer was allocated only a certain amount of fuel. And it gets to the point where if you've got 12 tanks in your unit, well, guess what? We're only getting fuel for 6 of them. So we got to leave 6 of our tanks behind as we advance with 6 tanks. So literally, it's not even the Russians that are causing a lot of the problems for our losses in striking ability. It's our own inability to supply those panzer divisions, right? It's the Germans' inability to keep things moving. By November 15th, temperatures are freezing. Now, this is both a good and a bad thing. Why do you think it'd be a good thing? Freezes the roads, so mud's no longer a problem. So it's easier to drive on the roads. But by this point, the Germans, now remember, we're already 8 days past our due date here, right? The Germans are just running out of steam. They're taking tremendous losses. They can't keep up because of their own logistical problems, and the Soviets are just really putting up a successful defense here. The Soviets fortify areas around Moscow. They build elaborate fortifications, minefields, as I say, and the Germans just get to the point where they just don't have the strength to push through those defenses. They're just on their last leg. They just don't have the strength. On December 4th, 1941, Bach calls an end to the offensive. At this point, some German units were so close to Moscow that through their binoculars they could see the spires of St. Basil's Cathedral. They're only like 15 miles. These are reconnaissance advanced units, but they can see Moscow. Meanwhile, the Soviets are gathering more and more. They're drawing on more and more men coming to Moscow to prepare for a counterattack here. You know, it's funny because there's a real problem in Russia to this day. There's a lot of forests to the west of Russia, and they are still death traps. There's all these mines and bombs from World War II are still active. There are some woods they say you just don't go in. Has everybody seen Valkyrie with Tom Cruise? It's a great film. You should see it. It's about the bomb plot against Hitler. We'll talk about it in a few weeks. But there's a scene right at the beginning where, Adolf Hitler's plane flies to meet the Russians near Smolensk, or to meet the German army near Smolensk. And they actually shot that in East Prussia. So that's kind of in, I guess what is Poland today. But they filmed that, and Tom Cruise was not in that scene, but he was an executive producer, and he was on the set that day. And he was there, and he said he and some friends, they were just walking around, and they just went to go look in the woods. And as they were walking in the woods, they said all these I guess they were Polish officials that were with them, came around and said, you do not go into these woods. You do not go into these woods, because there's still all this unexploded ordnance from World War II that's in there. I heard just the other day, they were trying to they found another bomb in London. They took it to like an army plant to take it apart, and no one happened to be there, and it just went off. And no one was hurt, but this bomb, World War II bomb, goes off. Every now and then that happens. You'll hear about they'll discover a bomb in Germany or in England, and so these things are still going. So in a very real way, World War II is still being fought. Okay, it's one of the reasons too. You'll remember Princess Diana. Her big thing, if I'm sure many of you are too young to remember, but Princess Diana, one of her big crusades was to get people to stop using landmines, because you bury a landmine and then you forget about it, and then people just are walking around. They're nasty things. The Germans believed when they're fighting in Moscow, when they're fighting in front of Moscow, that these forces they're fighting, the Soviets are on their last leg. One more great push, they'll be done. But again, as we know, the Soviets had been husbanding armies. They've been bringing power in there. So on December 5th, the day the Germans stopped pushing, on December 5th, the day after the Germans stopped pushing, the Red Army counterattacks. Okay? The Red Army counterattacks. And this is a massive offensive. The Soviets counterattack, as I say, on December 5th. And they try to do to the Germans what the Germans always do. They try to encircle, right? They try to encircle the Germans. They're not really able to do this at this point. The Soviets aren't able to do this at this point. So they can't really encircle all the German army, but they do manage to destroy, smaller formations, but they can't really completely destroy the German armies. And then, like I said, there's several problems with the Soviet tactics here. First of all, the Soviets are kind of doing what the armies would do in World War I with their tanks, and that is they're diffusing them. They're using tanks as kind of infantry support, and they're using them in kind of smaller piecemeal roles. So their tanks are spread out. As the Germans have shown us, the way you do it is you concentrate your tanks, and you use it as just this big spear thrust, right? So the Soviets aren't doing that. They're diffusing their tank power here. And also, too, they're diluting their strength. Instead of just focusing on one or two big areas to push at, they're trying to push at too many places. So again, it further dilutes their strength. A big part of blitzkrieg tactics is you don't stop to take strong points. You bypass them. If the enemy's strong somewhere, you don't just stop to fight it. You go around it. You cut it off. You cut off its supplies, its communications, and that will make it easier to take later, right? That's blitzkrieg tactics. The Soviets don't do that. They hit a strong point, and they stop, and they concentrate, and they try to take it. And that buys your enemy time to shift his units around, right? So Soviet tactics are not good at this point. They're still not good. Also, too, by late 1941, the Soviets lack good tanks in numbers. They lack good tanks in numbers. They have quite a few light tanks. In fact, as I mentioned, they have many of those British tanks. And they're still using cavalry. They're still using horse cavalry here. These things are far too weak to create the big kind of pincer enveloping movements that the Germans are famous for here. So they are advancing, and they are causing problems, but they're not destroying German field armies. They're not destroying German field armies. the way the Germans had destroyed Soviet field armies. But critically here in Moscow, they're learning. The Soviets are learning. And the lessons they learn here in Moscow are going to pay off greatly a year later, as we will see at Stalingrad. Now, the Soviets inflict significant casualties. They do manage to move the front further west from Moscow. And as the Germans are kind of forcing to fall back west somewhat, temperatures are dropping significantly. Temperatures are dropping significantly. German leaders are afraid that what happened to Napoleon's army will happen to them. They're afraid that what happened to Napoleon's army will happen to them. That is to say, they're scared if they keep retreating, the Soviets will ride them down, butcher them, just like they did the French. So Hitler, there's a fear that this retreat, this orderly retreat, will become a rout. Your guys will throw down their guns and just start running in a free-for-all. So Hitler here, in the midst of the Soviet counterattack, he does something very important. Hitler gives what was known as the not one step back order. Not one step back order, okay? Not one step back order. Now, this saves the Wehrmacht from destruction. Had Hitler not been firm saying, you do not retreat, arguably it would have been a rout and the whole German front in Russia would have collapsed. Now, the problem is, the lesson Hitler will take from that is, you always give this order. You always give this order. But the fact of the matter is, that's going to become less tenable as the war goes on. But it works in 1941. And that's what you did, and that's kind of reflective of Hitler's own experience in World War I. In World War I, they always said, you don't fall back, you hold the line, you hold the line. So it's kind of the way Hitler learned military tactics here. So the Battle of Moscow will last into the new year, into 1942, but it will fundamentally end as a Soviet victory, and critically, and this is one of the most important things you can take away from this battle, the Battle of Moscow is the very first time the Wehrmacht is stopped by another army. It's the very first time the Wehrmacht is stopped by another army. The only other thing that had ever stopped the Wehrmacht was geography. This time, it is an enemy army stops the Wehrmacht. So this is the end of Operation Barbarossa. This is the end of Operation Barbarossa. The German defeat before Moscow clearly signaled that the German army and its blitzkrieg tactics had failed. It had failed. All of the goals of this assault were not fulfilled. All of the goals were not fulfilled. The year ends, as we see, with a major Soviet counteroffensive. It was clumsy, but it did demonstrate that the Soviets had a lot of fight left in them. Now, in the aftermath of the battle, Hitler is so disgusted with the army's failure to take Moscow that he fires the commander-in-chief of the army. He fires the commander-in-chief of the army. Does anybody remember who was the commander-in-chief of the army at this time? Walter von Brauchitsch. Walter von Brauchitsch, okay? Walter von Brauchitsch was the commander-in-chief of the army since 1938. Hitler fires him. Hitler then, when he fires von Brauchitsch, he does something very radical here. Well, not radical for Hitler, but Hitler becomes himself commander-in-chief of the army. Now, Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor, is already commander-in-chief of the armed forces, of all of the armed forces. But now he takes a step even further down and says, but I'm also directly in command of the army. I am the direct commander of the army, just as I am the direct commander of all the armed forces. He also does something else here. Now, we talked about this again. We're talking about 1938. Hitler has two different kind of military staffs here. Remember what they are? OKH and OKW. What do they mean? Oberkommandeur der Wehrmacht, the Oberkommandeur der Heers. So the idea is the Oberkommandeur der Wehrmacht was kind of Hitler's personal military staff. And in theory, there were people that were in the OKW, like Alfred Jodl, who were saying, we really do need, and he was right, we really do need, in the 20th century, you really need to combine your Army, Navy, and Air Force under one command structure, a unified command structure. You really do need to do that. In fact, the Allies are going to be masters of that during World War II, as unity of command. Okay, they'll be masters of it. But the OKH is just the army, okay? Now, what Hitler is going to do then for the rest of the war is he's going to say this. The Oberkommando der Heers is going to be in charge of Russia. The war against Russia will exclusively be the domain of the Oberkommando der Heers, the OKH. The war against everybody else, the Western Allies, the Mediterranean, what have you, everywhere else will be under the command of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Now, as we know, Hitler often sets up these kind of competing agencies. He's kind of doing this here with the army, with a war. He's essentially saying we've got two different agencies running different parts of the war, and throughout the war they will compete for resources, manpower, and Hitler, of course, will let them fight it out and occasionally adjudicate things here. Now, German generals, after the war, many German generals who survive, they will write their memoirs. Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, these guys will write war memoirs, and they're usually not always reliable. They usually tend to downplay their role in atrocities and stuff like that. And we'll talk about the atrocities going on in Russia in a few weeks. But almost universally, to one extent or another, these German generals blame Hitler for the failures of the Wehrmacht. Okay? They blame Hitler. They blame him for the decision to split forces, to draw panzer reserves from north and south and give them to center. They blame him. They blame him for just about everything but the weather. Okay? And it's kind of a way to make themselves look good, but it's also a way to distance themselves from Hitler. And while there may have been some truth in it, a lot of these German generals' memoirs, as I say, are disingenuous, right? Franz Halder, he'll have his war diary, but Franz Halder, he'll be implicated in the bomb plot. He'll actually go to a concentration camp at the end of the war. And at the end of the war, after the war, President Eisenhower, the great general of World War II, will be president, of course, in 1952. He hires Franz Halder to essentially write a German history of the war, history of the war from the German perspective, right? And of course, it plays into this idea of if nothing else, the army in the East acted honorably. It was the SS that were causing problems, which is not the case. The army was just as up to their eyeballs in blood as the SS was. But they never discuss their crimes in the East. The army refuses to discuss their role in these crimes in the East. But the reality is, one of the big reasons why this operation fails is there's, of course, poor planning by generals and staff to begin with. Hurried, rushed, improvised planning. They didn't take their time with a lot of it past the initial attack. Again, and we saw this with the Nagorsky video last time, they didn't have... the Germans did not have enough winter clothing. They did not have winter uniforms. They thought it would slow them down. They just didn't plan for the possibility of this war going into the winter. Again, we beat France in 6 weeks. Surely we can beat Russia in that time or less. They actually agreed with Hitler on many of the details. Instead of blaming Hitler, they actually agreed with him. They saw this war as a racial war against Slavs and Jews, just like Hitler did. And they hated communism, just like Hitler did. They agreed to the drive on Moscow. They thought Operation Barbarossa was a good thing from the beginning. They didn't know the Soviets had such a mobilization base, that they would be able to mobilize so many men so quickly. They should have known this. There's no reason. This operation was based on a lot of wishful thinking by the Germans, by Hitler and the German staffs here. The Germans usually have overwhelming superiority at the point of contact, but even with that, is it sustainable? They should have known ultimately it would not be. You can say, as Nagorsky said in that video, you can say the Germans lost the war here at the end of 1941. In fact, I've heard it said the turning point of the war, if you have to find a turning point of the war, it's the first 2 weeks of December 1941. When the German advance stops, the Soviet counterattack begins, and the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, bringing America into it. Right? The first 2 weeks, if we have to say there's a turning point, that's as good a place as any to say. Okay?